Hello. Welcome everyone to another episode of Let There Be Answers. I'm Leandro, usually sitting behind the camera, but today, together with John, I'll be your host. John, where are you?
Hello, I am streaming to you live from Salt Lake City, Utah, where I have been attending the 50th annual Sunstone Symposium. So, this is a
What is that?
conference that is conference for the Latter day Saint movement or Mormonism, where all the different scholars and also it's about culture and all that kind of thing. And so, for example, people are probably aware that there's a lot of Mormon themed TV shows and cinema. So it's like it has those kind of things. There was a screening of a independent Mormon horror film, so that was kind of interesting. So I've been attending that, and I'll be back in Toronto tomorrow night.
Nice. Well, today we have quite a few questions that you have sent on the YouTube chat. We received some by email, by Facebook, and we will try to address them all as much as possible. We have a lot of questions. But, John, as I make sure that everything is okay with the stream, why don't you remind us about the next week and the usual things that you do at the beginning of the lectures?
Well, I want to welcome everybody to our history, theology, philosophy channel. Today, however, we are doing the Let There Be Answers podcast, as Leandro said. And so for the last couple weeks, people have been writing special comments and questions in both by sending them to us by text and email, but also by writing them on the different recent lectures that we've had. And so Leandro and I have been collecting all of those and getting those ready. And we are also following your chats right now on YouTube and Facebook and elsewhere. Mike is on the back end helping us out, and he will be feeding those to us. And so part of the idea of this is that this is an open thing where you can ask us about anything. And we'll do our best. You're going to also be able to stump us with some of these, I think, and that's fine. I want to tell you a little bit about next week. So we will have a regular lecture again next week when we are looking at the Stoic Jesus. And so Stoicism is one of the key moral ethical philosophies of the Greco-Roman world. It's one of the ones that became extremely popular. And so famously, the great Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius was a philosopher king who, in his meditations, had the meditations of a Stoic philosopher. And so we're going to look at to what extent the ethical teachings of Jesus maybe reflected that same kind of background that is present in his same context of the Roman world. And then we'll also look a little bit about how, as Christianity emerged and became ultimately the state religion of the Roman Empire, how that Christianity may have also co-opted some of Stoicism's ethical system post Jesus. And so I think that'll be an exciting way to, on the one hand, refresh ourselves and understand a little bit about Stoicism, remind ourselves about that, and then also look at it in how it had influenced Christianity, both the historical Jesus in the Gospels, and then also Christianity.
Thank you. And I remind everyone that we count on your support to continue to produce this content. Some of you have already been sending super chats on YouTube. Thank you so much for supporting our channel. You can also remember do it on our website, centerplace.ca. And we also count on your likes to help us get noticed. Okay, you ready, John?
Yeah. I love the system that you set up here, Leonard, because I can actually also see the comments in real time. And so, like Darth Ram is saying, have I seen the Book of Mormon on Broadway? I did see the Book of Mormon, the musical, when it was when I came to Toronto.
Yeah.
So it's nice that I can see what you're saying.
And I'm also, for those of you on Discord, I can see you too. So here we go. So I would like to start with a question that I got from Phil. Phil, I see you in the chat. Phil was asking, I wish to know more about the level of education Jesus had. What languages could he speak? What languages could he read and write? And which texts was he familiar with? And how do we know these things? And I wanted to start with this question, John, because I think it has a lot to do with what we do in this channel in general, because we explore topics and we have evidence and we try to arrive to conclusions, and sometimes there's very limited evidence, and then that leads us to conclusions, and sometimes there are certain things that we can say and certain things that are going to be speculative. And I think when we talk about the level of education that Jesus had and what languages he could read and write and those kind of things, that because of the limited evidence we have, is we really any conclusion might be speculative. Now, I'm going to try to answer that from the viewpoint of a theologian, and then I
Yeah.
would ask you to say your impression from a historical lens, since you've given several lectures on the historical Jesus. But I want to start by saying the overwhelming scholarly consensus is that Jesus of Nazareth was a historical figure, a man living in Galilee in the first century of this era. Um, the primary sources that we have are the Gospels, and to an extent, the canonical Gospels, and there are other sources that didn't make it into the canon, the New Testament. Now, when you approach what Jesus did and what Jesus said as a theologian, which is usually our main concern as opposed to what his educational background was, you immediately find that scholars even disagree on which sayings of Jesus we can trace back all the way to the historical Jesus, and what sayings may have been added later by the authors of these gospels to make a particular theological point. It doesn't mean that they were lying. Now, what we might know from the primary sources that we have is that Jesus belonged to a family, tecton, say the Gospels, which you can translate as carpenter or builder, and they were in this place, Nazareth, which at the time was right next to this Greco-Roman city that which one of the Herods was it? I just can't keep track of all the Herods. Herod was expanding this city at the time. So while Jesus was growing up, this would have been a place where people would come to work on the amphitheater and the baths and all these facilities that Roman cities had at the time. So for that kind of work, you didn't necessarily need to read and write. Now, there were schools for boys to learn how to read the Torah, but it's unclear that someone, a craftsman, would send their kids to learn to read the Torah. It was probably not essential. We know almost for certain Jesus spoke Aramaic, and because of the context, he may have known a little bit of Hebrew, learning Hebrew in the synagogue or hearing scripture. He could have known a little bit of Greek just by participating in this context in Galilee and this Greco-Roman city, Sepphoris. Now, other than that, we can see at the sayings of Jesus in the Bible, in the New Testament, there's echoes of the Torah. He seems to be very familiar with the prophets, the Psalms. There are echoes, parallels with other books like Proverbs, and there's even echoes with Greco-Roman literature. In one of the papers that I did for my seminary education, I did research on a saying where in the Gospel of Luke, where Jesus says, if they're not against, whoever is not against us is for us, which apparently you can trace back to the Roman author Cicero in one of his speeches. It's a defense. It's like a lawyer kind of defense, and this is something that Caesar was saying to Julius Caesar. Now, none of this, neither quoting Cicero or half quoting Cicero or quoting the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, means that Jesus actually knew how to read.
Right.
So that is what we can say is what's the most likely explanation for these sayings being attributed to Jesus, echoing the Bible, Cicero, and you name it, is that this was part of the culture, most likely, that even Roman sayings may have been, and aphorisms were things that were familiar to people in Palestine at that time. I don't know, John, what else we can say about this.
Yeah, no, that's a really good background. So, it's Herod Antipas the Tetrarch. So it's one of Herod's kids, and I know there's so many Herods, it's hard, right? So
Yeah.
he's called the Tetrarch because he doesn't get to have he isn't given by the Roman Senate. This is a client kingdom, and he's not given the whole kingdom that his father had had. Instead, he's given it's like a tetrarchy is like dividing it up into fourths, and so he's given this little area, Galilee and the Perea, and like you say, he's been building Greco-Roman cities there to be his little capitals because he doesn't have the whole. He doesn't get to control his father's capital of Caesarea, or he also doesn't get to control Jerusalem. But so there is the Galilee is a very kind of mixed zone. And so there are a lot of, Hellenism has been going on here now for, more than 3 centuries. And so there are lots of cities that have been refounded as Greek cities. And so right in the vicinity of this little Aramaic speaking village that Jesus is from is a big Greek city. So there's a lot of people who would have been bilingual, and maybe even craftsmen would have had like a little bit of, they would have known some Greek because that would have been what overseers or whatever that there are telling them what to do. And so just naturally there would have been some bilingualism there. They won't have been learning Latin, very likely. And if to the extent that there is some religious education going on, then that's where you're also learning some Hebrew, which is a very related language to Aramaic. And so maybe he has those. But again, the distinction here, I think that, like you're saying that you're making, Landro, is between, let's say, the Jesus of the Gospels. So the Jesus that's described in the Gospels by the evangelists who are writing, generations after the historical Jesus, they are saying that he can read. So it's very clear in the Gospel of Luke, Jesus opens up a Torah scroll, he reads out of the Torah scroll, and so he can read. But the issue is that Gospel's written in Greek. The quotation as given in the Gospel of Luke is from the Septuagint, so it is the Greek version. But again, that story may or may not have any historicity. That story could be entirely the invention, and may likely be entirely the invention of the author of the Gospel of Luke. And so the issue is not whether Jesus can read in the Gospels, as because he can, but the question is, when we are looking at these late, they're not that late, they're within a, but they're not immediate eyewitness sources.
Right.
How do we discern? And so a real minimalist will say, it may well be because of Jesus' background that he may not have been literate. He may have only spoken Aramaic and a little smattering of Greek. That said, you can also make a case, more maximalist, more historicity to the gospel traditions, in which case he's maybe literate in Greek and Aramaic and Hebrew. But again, it can't be known. So it depends on your reading. Certainly, people will say, no, he read it in the Gospels. Okay, that doesn't necessarily mean that the historical Jesus did that. So.
And since you mentioned that scene from the Gospels, we also have this scene where Jesus writes
In the
something
Gospel,
on the sand in the Gospel of John, when he's defending the woman taken in adultery.
right?
But
But it
again,
doesn't say what language he's writing in or anything like that.
the
And so,
Gospel doesn't even say what he wrote or what language.
and as we know, that little section, the pericope adulterii or whatever it's called, is that is actually not original to the Gospel of John. That doesn't mean it's not also an ancient source. It is, but it's an individual, free-floating Christian story. It doesn't necessarily it doesn't necessarily add much to our knowledge of the historical Jesus. So.
And even when we think about the education, I mean, do we know anything, or do the Gospels say anything other than the fact that he was a disciple, a student of John the Baptist?
So no, so that one is, I think all historians would agree that that's one of the qualities of the historical Jesus that we can be sure of. But a lot of times folks will also say, well, Jesus is a rabbi, rabbis have this and that and the other thing, but that is all based on much later sources. So, the Gospels are much earlier than the written sources for rabbinic Judaism, which are, in the second, third, fourth centuries and things like that, looking back to the time of Jesus and other rabbinic leaders who are the Pharisees, this early proto-rabbinic movement. But what an actual Jewish or Judean man in Galilee, even one who is a teacher, a rabbi, would be doing in the 30s, we don't have enough evidence to say. So there is a lot of speculation in this question. So.
Okay. Let's go to the next question from Rich66. And this comes from in one of our videos, Heraclitus and Parmenides clashing philosophies influence Gnosticism. And so Rich66 asks, can you argue about the conception of the Virgin Mary, who was not just visited like Europa by Zeus? So is it like a comparative mythology kind of question here?
Right. So this is like a divine origin story, mythologically or theologically, and so the the Zeus and Europa. This is an older story, right? And so this is going back to the oral tradition and mythology even before any of those ancient Greek writings get written down. And those kind of myths are much more about anthropomorphic, fleshy, embodied gods. So Zeus is very human looking, and he is it's called the rape of Europa, right? Is the way the story is known. And so we're talking about an actual sexual intercourse. Whereas it's a much the conception that's described, for example, in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, the two nativity stories that we have are they're later, they're literary, and they are being written by anonymous evangelists who are already Christian, who have a high Christology and understanding of Jesus as God, and they're certainly not talking about a physical relationship with God the Father and Mary in any way, and it's talking about being conceived of the Holy Spirit, where at the end of this Mary remains a virgin is the idea. And so this is again a sign of a divine birth, but it is expressed very differently than the earlier mythological ideas that would have been like the kind of the Greek gods.
Now, but since the question here, it comes in a video that is about Gnosticism, can we somehow connect this interaction between God and Mary with this gnosis?
So for the Gnostics are going to be way more. I mean, they have there's Gnosticism's very broad category, right? And so they're going to have different perspectives. But just as a thumbnail or shorthand, Gnostics tend to be very negative about the physical world and physicality. God, the true God for the Gnostics, is entirely spiritual, and God's the only begotten here, Jesus, is in fact that not a lot of Gnostics are even Docetist, which is to say Jesus only ever seemed to be human.
Right.
And so we would have been talking about something that is entirely spiritual or immaterial, as opposed to any kind of physical coupling. And I'll just mention that all of this is in the background of an ancient world that really biologically doesn't understand how babies are made. I mean, they understand how to do it, but they don't understand how it works. So the background in the like in the kind of Greek philosophical, which natural philosophy, that is to say science at the time, is that there's this idea that the woman is like a field and the man is planting seeds in the field. You know what I mean? In other words, there's not this idea that each parent is providing genetic material, as we now know, through and so therefore they don't have this idea at all, and so it is all of these ancient ideas are not based on any knowledge about how genetics works, because they didn't know.
Now, in the Gnostic conversation, also, we have in the Gnostic Gospels lecture, 14 Solomon 14 asks, what's the proof that the Ebionites continued into Arabia? There were no Christian tribes before, during, and after Islam. Most of the Christian tribes lived north of Arabia in the Roman Empire.
Right. So I think that maybe in that lecture, what we're talking about here is, so this Ebionite groups are what we've talked about as the early Christians who continued to live Mosaic law in some way or other. That doesn't mean that they're following all of later rabbinic Judaism, but they are keeping kosher. They are obeying the law of circumcision. Maybe they're worshiping still on Saturday as opposed to Sunday. So these are a carryover, what we've called sometimes the Jamesian or Jacobin church, but there are, in Matthew's community, for example, the community that produced the Gospel of Matthew, they are also seemingly still living some kind of Mosaic law. And so over time, that becomes an alternative Christianity that is viewed as heretical by the main line of proto-Orthodoxy, what becomes the Roman and Greek, the Nicene Christian Church. And so over time, this group becomes marginalized. And of course, it's initially founded in Galilee and Judea. This is where it originally exists. And as it doesn't spread as much as the sort of Pauline Gentile Christianity, it kind of stays there. And so once they are persecuted, the idea is that some of them are perhaps hounded out. And so one of the evidences for that is not like the questioner here has asked, well, no whole Arab tribe may be converted to this kind of Christianity, but just because not everybody did, that doesn't mean that there aren't some Christians, right? And so even in the early Muslim tradition, Muhammad has relatives who are Christian. And from what we can see, for example, in traces of the Quran, it may well be that the kind of Christianity that Muhammad's relatives were is Ebionite Christianity. And so one of the sources of evidence for this is that the understanding of who Jesus is in Islam, including some of the passages in the Quran and other hadith, seem to be indicating that the Christianity that Muhammad was most familiar with and most exposed to may have been an Ebionite Christianity.
And some more Gnostic question, but this one comes from the Gospel of Thomas lecture. Kimaros Key 5670 asks, is there a relationship between saying 114 in the Gospel of Thomas and Luke 10:42? What are these passages?
Well, so saying 114 in the Gospel of Thomas is that one that I've complained about and struggled with. This is the one where Peter says, let Mary go forth out away from us. Women aren't worthy of life. So Peter is having a very dismissive of Mary as a female apostle or female disciple. Presumably what's meant is the Mary Magdalene, although the Gospel of Thomas does not clarify that that's who we mean here. We just infer that that's who's meant. But Jesus then says, no, that's not the way it is, because I'm going to make her male so that she can become a living spirit like you males. For every woman who makes herself male shall enter the kingdom of heaven. And so this is expressing a proto-Gnostic idea that that part of physical existence here is that we are we are in a condition of division. That the true spiritual life of humanity is an integrated human that is not male or female, but is both male and female, and so we've been divided into that. And part of retaining oneness will be for women to also become male and male to become female. In other words, so that both, when God, it says in Genesis, male and female created God them, humans in God's image. For Gnostics, that needs a return to unity. So that's the saying 114. And so the question here is that related to a statement that we find in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 10, verse 42. And this is the story found only in Luke, but it's a very popular story among Christians about Mary and Martha. And so they're two sisters. Jesus is visiting them. Martha is, because she's hosting, she's doing all this housework and making sure, to get the whole place ready. And Mary isn't helping at all. She's just sitting there listening to Jesus, preach and teach and so forth. And so in that verse, after Martha's complained to Jesus, Jesus says to Martha, only one thing is needful, and Mary hath chosen the good part, and that won't be taken from her. I think it's interesting. The questioners kind of brought that together, but I don't think that these are related at all. I think that the story from Luke is about a different figure. She's still named Mary. Everybody in the New Testament, all the women are named Mary. And this Mary is, this Mary is often called Mary of Bethany, but is not identified as that in this. It's actually the Mary, the sister of Martha, in the Gospel of Luke. And again, like I say, this story is only found in Luke. I don't think this is related, because I was just describing what Thomas means, which is this Gnostic idea. The idea that between Mary and Martha, I think that this is a description. One of the reasons why I think it speaks to Christians is that this is a description for early Christians about church worship, which is, on the one hand, we have to get all of the stuff ready to have, like an in-person church service, but potentially doing all that kind of work is not really the point of church, getting the chairs set up and all the food and so forth, whatever you're going to do. It's actually listening to the gospel. And so I think that that's what's being said, as opposed to anything about wholeness kind of and gender and things like that, like Gnostics have.
But I think that the comparison here has to do with on in the Gospel of Thomas. It looks like Jesus is saying something pretty horrible to Mary, like it's very and a misogynist. And then on the other hand, in the Gospel of Luke, we have a much more positive and in a way even an inclusive approach to women and priesthood, or the women approaching God. And so I think that's the clash that maybe this viewer is talking about. But maybe what this comparison tells me here is a little bit of what happens when we take these passages completely out of context without knowing what it really, what would happen before and after.
Oh, I totally agree, Leandro. And I think, because again, we when we read Thomas saying 114, we do think, well, that sounds terrible. That sounds misogynistic from our perspective. But actually, I think that the author there was actually trying to be very inclusive of women, and was actually, so the problem is that people in antiquity, the baseline is so misogynistic that when you talk about gender, even when you are trying to say no, women should be apostles, women should be allowed to be disciples, women can have eternal life, women can be philosophers, the surrounding context is so bad, it sometimes is worse than if you just had kept your mouth shut. Or it sounds worse anyway.
And then, nevertheless, we need to be cautious, because that is one of the rationales that evangelical and the more conservative theologians use to try to reconcile the the bad parts of the Bible and to try to say, well, yeah, but in that context, it was good, or in that context, this is how God spoke to people at the time, because otherwise they could not understand it in any other way. But regardless, it doesn't matter if you're like a conservative or more liberal reader of the Bible. It's you need to get the context. You can't just take a saying completely out of context like that when you make these comparisons, especially. Okay, and then the next question is on the Gospel of the Gnostic Mary Magdalene lecture. Ali in London asks, do you think it's reasonable to say that Mary Magdalene has been deliberately discredited, presented badly, which is related to the question we were just talking
Right.
about?
Yeah. So we talked about with Mary Magdalene. There's so many Marys, right? And so one of the things that happens is lots of different characters get conflated. So people would like to believe that all of these people are the same, and so Mary in the Mary and Martha story is also then, Mary of Bethany. Mary of Bethany, anoints Jesus's feet in the Gospel of John. In the Gospel of Luke, an anonymous woman anoints Jesus's feet, and that anonymous woman is called a sinful woman. And so, even though that anonymous woman, who is very clearly not, she could have been named Mary because all the women are named Mary, but we don't know that. She's not Mary Bethany. She's not Mary Magdalene. Nevertheless, by the time we get to Pope Gregory the First, and one of the a very very influential, maybe sometimes called the first medieval man. So one of an influential thinker. He kind of conflates these all together, and so he's the one who says, "Well, Mary Magdalene had been a sinful woman," and so this is. And so then the question, and then later, having made that conflation, which is not correct, uh, later in maybe modern times, that has been sometimes used to denigrate Mary Magdalene.
Mm-hmm.
So in other words, here she is. She had been given in the Catholic Church the title Apostle to the Apostles because in the Gospel of John, she is the first disciple to see the risen Christ, and then she goes and tells the other disciples, and therefore the whole point of being an apostle is to share the good news. She's the one who tells the apostles, so apostle to the apostles. So I don't think that Pope Gregory the First was trying to denigrate her in any way. I think that within, especially a Catholic, and this is proto-Catholic, but anyway, a Latin Church understanding of repentance and things like that. I think the idea that you had been living your life and then you are transformed and then you become an apostle is actually just fine. So it's not necessarily a source of denigration. Matthew is a tax collector, so he has a sinful position, but then he changes his life and goes. So having that kind of a moment, the Gospel of Luke actually says that Mary Magdalene is one of the women who had been possessed of a demon or something like that Jesus has cast out of her. That is not denigrating her. That is this is part of the thing where people, the whole idea of repent and follow me. That means turn your life away from your former worldly life and now become fully committed. And so I don't think that it was ever meant that way. But the whole idea that Mary Magdalene is a sinful woman or a prostitute is non-biblical. And so in modern times, it may well have been used, making that, might be a denigration, but it's not meant that way.
And the question is not necessarily about if that's how Mary Magdalene is portrayed in the Gospels, but maybe look, what you're saying is probably like that's the tradition that developed in that
Yeah.
way, and but not all tradition. But what I still see a lot when you listen to sermons, when you go to a different church and you listen to a sermon, there's a lot of this conflating all the women in the Bible are just the same one woman, and it's usually Mary Magdalene that
Yeah.
where all of a sudden that's the only female character in the Bible and the mother of Jesus. But
Yeah.
then as a result, we read a passage of scripture that doesn't really say that this woman is a sinner or this woman, did anything wrong, and yet the preacher will assume, yeah, and that because she is a sinner, and where does it say that? In some other book of the New Testament, maybe, but not in this book that you're talking about today. So I think
Yeah.
that's another issue that we have in Christianity, even trained seminarians sometimes.
Well, and again, I think that part of that, what you're saying there, is that. So this is also reading it as a seminarian, as a person who is trying to read it because you're using the Gospels
Yeah,
religiously as opposed to as a
theological,
historian.
exegetical perspective.
Yeah. So from a historical perspective, that whole idea that story includes the detail that the woman anointing Jesus as a sinful person, I think we can say it from a historian perspective. I would say that's a total invention of Luke. So the original source that Luke is reading from, which would have been Mark, doesn't include that. Luke has completely transformed that story, completely taken it out of its original Markan context. Luke has totally repurposed it, and in repurposing it, Luke has created that detail. And so, whether that story has any historicity or not, I wouldn't. I mean, that depends on what you're reading of Mark, but that is, it is not a historical detail.
Question on the lecture on the Gospel of Thomas and Q from Max Harden, who says, do we know that Q was written and not just oral tradition?
So, at some point or other, the sayings are written down. We know that, and we know, for example, that the sayings are written down in the Gospel of Luke, and they're written down in the Gospel of Matthew. So there's where we have written sources for sure. Prior to that moment, there is an oral tradition. And so the only connection that we have of those sayings to the historical Jesus is via oral tradition, because the historical Jesus did not write anything down. There are no eyewitnesses that wrote anything down. So instead, what's happening is an oral tradition. And that oral tradition has made the language jump from their original language that Jesus would have been speaking in Aramaic to the language that they're written down in, as first we have them, which is Greek. But we know we believe the hypothesis is that there is this Q source that is a literary source, and the evidence that it's a literary source is that the literary dependence between the versions that we have in Matthew and Luke means that they are based on a literary source. So whether or not that's Q, that's not entirely agreed. That's a hypothetical, but those are being pulled from some literary source. They're not just like playing telephone, because they're too dependent on one another. In other words, they're literarily dependent. We are getting the same exact wording, and that's not how the oral tradition works. So both the authors of Luke and Matthew are pulling from a source, or for example, if we don't believe the most commonly accepted hypothesis, the Q hypothesis, Luke is for example has Matthew in front of Luke, and Luke is using it that way. But we know that there is literary dependence, and so if there is a Q is a written source.
Thank you. And we have a question that came in the live chat from Kinetic, who says, I wonder what the New Testament would look like if it wasn't for Greek thought, especially the Platonic form of good.
So I can't imagine that it would exist. So it would be totally different. And same thing, whatever existence any component of Judaism would have. So for example, all of Second Temple Judaism, from the time frame when the Torah itself becomes important. We've looked at that. We did a lecture on when did the Torah become authoritative, and we saw that it really took off and was really happening in the Hasmonean period, the period of the Maccabees, which is to say the Hellenistic period, and it is part of a response that the Judean people are having to the Hellenism. It's a reaction to that. And so, if there was no Greek thought, if the Greeks, if the Macedonians, or Alexander had not conquered, the Middle East, none of this would have happened in that way. So the interaction with Judaism would have continued to be with Zoroastrianism, I guess. And so Judaism itself would be totally different, and it may and I don't know that Christianity would have emerged. Christianity is completely dependent on Hellenistic, as we have it, is completely dependent on Hellenistic thought, because the whole idea of Christ as the Logos, Greek idea, is coming from that Hellenized Jewish background.
Right. And so really what I'm hearing here is that all these traditions and all these the text that we call scripture and the thought that is included there, it doesn't just develop in a vacuum, but these cultures are interacting with their neighbors, the empires that conquer them, and so on. So really, there might be, if you go back to the Hebrew Bible, there might be, things that, well, I mean, we know that you find are responses to the things that were happening with Assyria, with Babylon, with Egypt, and so on.
Yeah. Well, I can say, like, for example, I think it's possible to potentially conceive of Christianity without the Romans conquering it, the empire. So in other words, if there had just continued to be, some kind of a Hellenistic kingdom there, but because the Roman layering is more recent and less important, perhaps, and so then we could maybe kind of prune out things. But I think that Christianity, because it emerges entirely out of Hellenized Judaism, it's like such an important component of the synthesis. You just can't pull the one out and have anything there.
So there's another question. This one comes from the lecture, Who was John the Baptist? This is from Golden Lover 9803, who says, and this is also about Q. Apparently,
Okay.
Q did not mention Jesus' name when John references the one coming after him, when John the Baptist says that. So are you not putting words into the mouth of Q's author? This because in your lecture, John, apparently you said that where does Q quote Isaiah to specifically point to and mention Jesus as his forerunner?
Well, so or mention that he's the forerunner of Jesus. So yeah. So you're right that I have made a surmise here. This is how it's essentially always interpreted. But why do I make that surmise? So the Q document, as it's reconstructed, essentially has two sets of sayings. So there are sayings from John the Baptist at the very beginning, and then there are sayings from Jesus, and that is the whole bulk of the document. So the John the Baptist part is very small, and it includes the idea that the one is coming after me, and I'm not worthy to tie his sandals or something like that. So in other words, this idea that John already in Q is being portrayed not as the historical John the Baptist would have, but as a post Jesus Christian understanding of John the Baptist, how Christians have understood John the Baptist. In other words, that John is saying that in this Q saying that he's subordinated to, and like you say, I'm surmising subordinated to Jesus. But he's saying he's subordinated to somebody, but
Right.
I am
Who
making
might
that.
that be?
But what we do have is that immediately following that in the Q document, there is all the Jesus sayings, and so the implication is that it's the one who's coming after him. Who comes after him in the document is all the Jesus sayings, and the International Q project that is done the most to reconstruct all of this. They also believe that between between the John sayings and the Jesus sayings, there is a part that has been so distorted by Luke and Matthew that we can't reconstruct, but nevertheless would have been about a baptism moment where John baptizes Jesus. And so all they have been able to reconstruct of that is words Jesus, John, baptize, heaven opened, spirit upon him, son. And so that's how the Q project tries to reconstruct that fragment. So in other words, they're saying is there is some kind of a story of John baptizing Jesus and maybe the Spirit coming upon Jesus, but descending upon Jesus. But you are correct that I have made a surmise there. It's the surmise that is, I think, everyone universally makes usually.
Thank you. And we have a question that comes from the live chat with a super chat. Thank you so much, Zorak1997, who asks, some Second Temple apocalyptists believed in a judgment day and rising of the dead. Jesus knew that John the Baptist was executed and he could now be a target. Might Jesus have predicted his death and rising and influenced in this way ideas about his resurrection? And I think I would like to hear your answer to this question, because I find it very related to the opening question in this Let There Be Answers about what we know and what we can conclude about. And so I wonder
Right.
what do you have to say about this, John?
Right. So it's difficult to try to reconstruct if that would have happened. So it's a matter of deciding what statements go back to the historical Jesus. Did the historical Jesus actually predict his death and his rising, or because all of the writings we have are already written by Christians who've already come to believe that the purpose that they all know that Jesus was executed, and they all have come to believe that he rose. Actually, there's nothing for that um, in. There's very little anyway in Q that talks about that. The Q source is not as interested in worrying about the resurrection of Jesus, but the other sources, the other early writings, Mark and the other gospel writers are. And so my personal tendency, I tend to always err kind of on the side of more minimalism and hanging as close to the sources as I can. I just admitted in the last one of these questions that I did make that one surmise that John is talking about Jesus coming after him, which is not precisely what the source said. And so it has to have a little bit of surmise. But I tend to think that that Jesus's execution is unexpected, and that the idea that his later followers, the proto movement that becomes Christianity, that is where that they became they came to believe in his resurrection after they began having visions of him being resurrected,
Mm-hmm.
and that therefore the predictions are then retroactively inserted, as opposed to something that he believed. There is definitely, I mean, so definitely, this movement includes apocalypticists. Bart Ehrman absolutely presents Jesus himself as a failed apocalyptic prophet. The sayings of John that we have present him as an apocalypticist. Certainly, the author of Mark is an apocalypticist. That said, just because you believe in a day of judgment, and you believe in the end of the world, and you believe in a literal resurrection, that doesn't necessarily mean that Jesus was predicting that he would be resurrected in this way. So,
Right. But my point to related to the what we can know about Jesus is this is one of those questions. It's like, okay, but do we know that Jesus ever spoke about his the his the historical Jesus? Did he ever talk about the possibility that he was going to get executed because his teacher John the Baptist had been executed? And again, is it's speculative to to say that he would have said that, but even more so to talk about the possibility that the historical Jesus actually talked about his resurrection. And yet we have to look at this context where, like, Judgment Day, Apocalypticism, and resurrection of the death were beliefs, were developments in Jewish religion that were happening, and that may have all these things associated. The way that people associated all these ideas to Jesus may have come later, and that
Right.
might be a much more plausible way of explaining, what was inserted, what we today read in the Gospels.
Yeah, exactly. And the reason why I tend to think that so that this would be a later one. So one of the things that when something is really important in Christianity but doesn't immediately seem to have necessarily been important in the time frame of the living historical person, then that is one of those criteria where you sort of say, well, you can see why Christians would make this up because it's important to them.
Right.
Whereas if it's a thing that is not part of Christianity, why would they make that up? In other words, it's actually an embarrassment to Christian understanding of things. Then that has more, that criterion maybe means it more likely to date back to the historical Jesus, since they're unlikely to make it up. And the reason why I'm more likely to dispute, to my personally discount this one, is because there are indications in places like Q, like I say, which is whether this is not the prediction that Jesus has, but rather that in the Q saying source, I think that they're seeing Jesus and John as prophets who have sealed their prophecy in blood, as opposed to seeing them as a guy who dies and is going to get resurrected, and then another guy who dies and gets resurrected. Because I think that in that case, John, we don't really have that for John. It's a special thing that we have for Jesus the later Christian understanding. But that said,
Uh,
if you are more of a maximalist and you want to say that more and more and more of the sayings actually go back to the historical Jesus, then maybe that's how you could start to make the argument. So,
let's move on. We have two questions from the lecture, The Ethics of Jesus. Storytime Jesus asks, is it possible that Mark is pointing to the incident in Ezra when Mark has Jesus say, what God has put together, let no one separate? And to give you a little bit of background, this is from Ezra 10, verse 10, where Ezras, the priest, arose and said to the people, and separate yourselves from the peoples of the land and from the strange wives. And then later on in Ezra, we read the sons of Jesus, the sons of Jesus, the son of Josedek, and his brethren, Messiah and Eleazar and Jerib and Gedaliah, and they pledged themselves to put away their wives. So is this what Mark is pointing at when he says, what God has put together, let no one separate?
so that's an interesting idea. I mean, I like the thinking here that I guess it was Storytime Jesus has brought up, because by the way, I find I'm on not on Team Ezra, so I think that Ezra, in wanting to create this new idea and understanding of a pure bloodline where we're not gonna accept Moabites or other people of the land into our congregation. Um, I'm That's in opposition to contemporaries, as we've said in a lecture where we did a lecture about Ezra versus Ruth, where the author of Ruth, kind of contemporaneously to Ezra, is actually saying, no, in fact, David himself is the descendant of a Moabite. And so this would be an example of seeing Jesus as on Team Ruth and not on Team Ezra, which I think is true. So I think Jesus is on Team Ruth and not on Team Ezra, and so is Leandro. But I don't actually think that that's what this pronouncement is talking about. I mean, in some sense, it's not specifically talking about this incident anyway. I think it's definitely talking about the tradition of Jewish law that as it exists in Second Temple Judaism, which allows for a relatively easy divorce when for a man to put off, to divorce his wife and often leave them therefore destitute. And so I think Jesus is responding to that historical incident and saying there's a lot of injustice that happens, when women and who've been cast away are now economically, immediately impoverished. They don't have the capacity to take care of themselves and their children and things like that. And so I think that that's what Jesus is reacting to in his immediate context. I think that if he was actually yelling at Ezra the way I sometimes do, I think he would quote Ezra specifically, like the way he does. You've heard it said, an eye for an eye and tooth for tooth, but I say. In other words, he'll quote and he'll redo. And so I think he's actually responding to his immediate context as opposed to looking back at what was being done 400 years earlier.
Okay. We have another question on the ethics of Jesus, but first, a very important question that comes also from Zorak. Is Leandra wearing a Cheer Bear t-shirt from Care Bears? I don't know what that is, but no, this is
You don't
just
know the Care Bears, Leandro?
I do know the Care Bears, but I don't know the shirt. No, this is just a Toronto shirt.
Okay, Toronto.
Toronto
Very
with
with a
after a
rainbow.
rain. Okay. The other question on the ethics of Jesus is from Dan Talman 5345, who says, um, so not challenging the point that you made in this lecture, John, but this viewer is curious as to why it is assumed that the sinful woman in Luke 7 was a prostitute. And he mentions that they mention that the parallel stories in Mark 14, Matthew 26, and John 12 don't even describe this woman as sinful. And I think we talked a little bit
Yeah.
about this already. What else can we add?
So yeah. So we did mention this before. So like Dan Tallman here is saying, these do not in the parallel stories, including Mark, which is an earlier story than Luke, but the parallel in Matthew, and this is a rare one where where we also have a parallel story in John. None of them have this detail of the woman being sinful, which is why I said in the earlier question that, to my way of thinking, therefore, this idea that the woman is sinful at all is simply an invention of the author of Luke, who has taken this story and has completely repurposed it compared to the other gospels. So the other gospels are all using this story in order to, it's right before the time. It kicks off in the Gospel of John, the Passion story. So what's happening is that the woman who's not sinful is anointing Jesus with funerary ointments and funerary oils to indicate Jesus' impending death and resurrection. And that's what that's for. The author of Luke has pulled that story out of that, put it into a completely different earlier context, and is set it in the home of a guy named I think Simon the Pharisee. And the story is used instead to be a story about hospitality and also about inclusion, so that Jesus is perfectly this rich guy who has brought Jesus, allowed him to have dinner with him. He is noticing that Jesus is allowing this sinful woman to do this anointing thing and he thinks that means Jesus can't be a prophet, because Jesus, if he were a prophet, he would know who this woman is. But Jesus is saying, no, I know who this woman is, but I don't cast sinners out. In other words, all of the things that you all are finding sinful and you're causing them to exclude people from the congregation, that's not how things are supposed to work in my ministry. And so it is a completely repurposed story. The idea that the woman is sinful is the creation of the author of Luke. And to your point, though, and when I just immediately started saying then a prostitute, it doesn't have to be a prostitute. That's a surmise. That's just the most common idea of what the sin would be for a woman. But I mean, when I used the example before of a sinful person, a sinful man might well have been like a tax collector or someone who is, in the eyes of the local, not keeping kosher in whatever way. This could be the sinful woman is not likely to be a tax collector, but let's say she could be an adulterer or something like that. In other words, there could have been any number of other things that isn't that, but as a shorthand, as the author of Luke has just created this detail anyway. I think it's all right to. I mean, that's just a surmise. Sinful in some way, so maybe prostitute, but doesn't have to be. That's a good point.
There's another question on this lecture on the ethics of Jesus from As Above, So Below. Why, and we're now entering into the deep theological question segment. Why do people believe that Jesus is God? Is it because in the Old Testament, when they use the term Lord, they mean God, and the New Testament, when they use Lord, they are referring to Jesus? Jesus prayed to his Father in heaven, so he can't pray to himself.
Right. Yeah. So we have had a bunch of lectures on the Trinity and how complicated this is, and so one of the arguments that I don't know sometimes Arians make. So if you were an Arian Christian and you were talking to a modalist monarchist Christian, you would say Jesus prays to the Father in the garden. So therefore, your idea as a modalist monarchist, that which is to say that God simply appears in three different forms or modes. God is the Father in one context, God is Jesus in another context, God is the Spirit, but the Spirit is the Father, Jesus is the Father is the Spirit. That's modalism. That argument that you just made about Jesus praying to the Father makes it like, well, that seems pretty silly then, right? Because Jesus in multiple places prays to the Father. And so Arians are able to get through that very easily because in Arianism, Jesus is a fully distinct God from God the Father, and specifically, Jesus is um, is a finite God, the first God created by
Created.
God with a big G, right? So in Arianism, ultimately Jesus is a little g God, as opposed to the big G God. And so then they don't have any problem with that, the little g God praying to God, because and again, Jesus is the first of all creation and is so much more important than everything else that's created, but is there nevertheless less by infinity than the infinite God. So the complexity becomes the Trinity, which is that's why we've had a whole bunches of lectures on it. So the Father is God, Jesus is God, the Spirit is God, but Jesus is not the Father. So therefore, when as a distinct personage, when Jesus prays to the Father, Jesus is not praying to Jesus. Jesus is praying to the distinct being and entity, and that's that's a paradox. It's a logical conundrum. That is, but it doesn't mean that Jesus is praying to himself. So,
And I wonder if a little bit of what we're asking here is about the language use,
yes,
because as above, so below asks about the term for Lord or God that is used in
yes,
the Old and New Testament, but it's even more complicated than that. So if you read the Hebrew Bible in Hebrew, or at least a Hebrew Bible that has the original names of God, is not as simple as what you're saying here, because it's more like, when you see the word Lord, and in some translations you will see it in all caps,
right,
LORD in English, all caps. That means that the word that you have in the Hebrew original is the tetragrammaton that
right,
we pronounce Yahweh. And usually when you see the word God is the word Elohim, which is plural of El, which just means God, but also it is something that happened in West Semitic languages, that the name of God eventually become like a common noun to mean God, or to mean Lord.
Right. Yeah, and so we have a bunch of like the I mean the word, the word Lord is Adonai, right? And so that's why we have a god like Adonis, that is a Middle Eastern god that makes his way into Greek mythology, and there's a name that is a loan word from that, meaning Lord. And so, but I do think that in this case, that in terms of that term about Lord and that confusion there, that as above as below, who asked this question is making a point, because this is part of Paul's development of a very high Christology early on. And so Paul's testimony is that you must believe that Jesus is Lord. And by that, he means that Jesus is this logos, the God's present made manifest in the world. So the glory of God, the wisdom of God, the word of God. So the Yahweh, the Tetragrammaton God, the source, which can't be seen or felt in the world, but nevertheless God's logos can be God's, which is to say, anywhere where you see evidence of the Creator in the world, that, according to Paul, you must believe is Jesus. And so that is why there's that Lord, that's why Jesus is Lord in the New Testament. So.
All right. We have another what if question.
Okay.
But you have to answer, John. You can't speculate. Okay.
Okay. Yeah.
What
No.
if the Roman Empire had actually relapsed into paganism after Constantine, and now someone asks, in relationship to this question, Mr. City, I often wonder what if my own country, Germany, would look like if it had never been Christianized. Would we still worship the ancient gods and have our sacred trees in the middle of the village?
Yeah. So when you go back in time and do a counterfactual, the problem is that things don't, there's not just one switch and then nothing ever changes after the one thing happens. And so let's say uh, lots of Germans actually Christianized before they actually entered the Roman Empire. There were Christian missionaries who specifically converted most of them to Arianism. We were just talking about, while the empire itself made Nicene Christianity its religion, and so that was happening. But let's say they didn't get converted, and the Roman Empire itself, under Julian, had created this, what I called like a state religion of paganism. So I would say that world religion that has its pagan mythology and the forms and the names of God, nevertheless becomes kind of a monotheist philosophical religion anyway, that would look very much like Christianity, even though we would have names like Zeus and Hera and things like that. So you wouldn't pray to Saint Sebastian or Saint Mary or something like that. You could pray to Hera or Aphrodite or something like that, but you'd still understand there's like one source, whether it's the Stoic God or the Neoplatonic God. It nevertheless would be very similar to how Christianity works. So what I would say that would happen for the Germans are, you could continue to have, you could have a religion that could have emerged like that, and it sort of would look like Hinduism does, where Hinduism has become kind of a world religion that has maintained its understanding of, like old gods, and that continues to be part of the mythology and understanding, even while a kind of more sophisticated world religion, in some cases described by adherents as monotheist, in that there's one source, even if there's millions of divine beings that emanate from that source in Hinduism. So you could look like that, and you could still have maintained those German gods. But the other thing that could have happened is anything could have happened. So let's say there's a steppe people like the Avars, the Huns, the Mongols, somebody like that, who becomes maybe they become Manichees, or maybe they become Buddhists, because Central Asian people became Manichees and Central Asian people became Buddhists. And let's say, because of history's all changed now, those guys, one of those guys conquered Germany. Well, then you could have been forcibly Buddhist, made Buddhists, or Manichees or something like that. So it's we don't know what would happen.
Yeah, and you also have the opposite. Like sometimes you might convert, but you keep most of your traditions that you had in all the, uh, the native traditions continue and are reinterpreted uh, for in the new context of the new religion. And I can think of that, like I'm from South America. There's many cases where the Virgin Mary is associated with Pachamama, which is like an
Right.
Andean goddess, and there are hymns to this goddess, and it's reframed as the veneration of Mary.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so lots of these different traditions live on, and so at the one thing that I think that a lot of times when people look back on on this side of the Enlightenment, especially on this side of the Victorian era, they associate Christianity with all kinds of ills that especially includes um, uh, being prudish about sex and things like that, and I think that could have happened anyway. I've talked about that in terms of the philosophical paganism had already been going down that route in the Roman Empire, and again the fact that Christianity hit that way in the modern era under the Victorian era, that doesn't necessarily have to have. I mean, anything could have happened once you go back and fiddle with history as of the year 400, right? So
Okay, one more question about theology, deep theology, from Arianism versus the Trinity, from Bestow 993. If God is incomprehensible and the Trinity is complicated, then is everyone talking about the same Trinity? If the Father is greater than the Son, like Jesus said, does not imply a distinction? If Jesus will be seen sitting at the right hand of God, does that not also imply a distinction? And I have to add here because Fastball Flakes ask any tips or hints for how I can enter a discussion about the Trinity while avoiding immediate heresy. How do we do
just
this?
just take that diagram. The diagram that I always reproduce. This is the only way you can avoid heresy. So you write Deus, you put that in the middle, and then you write est pater Deus est filius Deus est spiritus sancti, and then you write spiritus sanctus non est filius, or pater non est filius filius non est spiritus sancti. It's a lot of Latin, but anyway, no, the Father is not the Son, and so forth. That's how you avoid it. If you want to do anything else where you say, well, it's like a three-leaf clover, or you say it's like a river that has a headwaters of, or it's like water that is sometimes vapor and sometimes ice and sometimes liquid. No, none of those things. Those are all heresies. So anyway, so no, for this question, in terms of this complexity of it, so yes, you're making an argument, Bestow, from scriptural references, right? So you're saying Jesus says in the Gospel of John that the Father is superior to him. A lot of the different references we have Jesus sitting at the right hand of the Father. Which doesn't necessarily imply subordination the way the other one does. You also were quoting from Proverbs, where we have that this idea that's embedded in the wisdom tradition of the Hebrew Bible that gave us that idea of the Logos, where wisdom incarnate is speaking in the book of Proverbs and says, "I was with the Creator at the beginning. I was the first of His creations." So that certainly that Proverbs part informs and was used by Arians. So Arians are able to say, look at Proverbs. If Christ is holy wisdom, Christ or wisdom says here that she was created at the at the very first of God's creation and is therefore subordinated. And so the problem would be trying to make our disparate biblical texts, let's say, more authoritative than the philosophical idea or the theological idea. So, in point of fact, actually, the theology is more important. And then everybody, once you have made your theological, once you've decided, and then you fit all your Bible verses to fit it, And so, because the Bible is contradictory, so you can't just do it based on the Bible. So how do Nicene Christians get away from Jesus saying that the Father is superior? Well, they say that's true in the sense that Jesus is fully human and fully divine. And so the Father, who is divine in all aspects, is superior to the only begotten, to the Logos, because in terms of the human component. But that doesn't mean that overall the person of Christ, the person of the Logos, is inferior to the Creator in any way, but merely the human part. Now, that apologetic answer may not be that you may not like that. You may not say, "Oh, that's very satisfying, John. You've gotten your way out of that." But that's how Nicene Christians get out of it in terms of trying to reconcile one of the contradictory Bible verses to their own theological idea. I mean, if you're going to be an Arian, there's other things that also don't work. If you're going to be a modalist, there's things that don't work, because the Bible has written by people who don't have one idea in mind, and you later have to kind of piece it all together. You have to get to your idea, and then you try to make the Bible fit it. That's my view.
I agree, it's complicated. I won't.
So Leandra's not gonna become a virgin to heresy by trying to explain the Trinity.
Okay, let's go. Let's move on.
You want me to read this one? So, in the lecture, as Yahweh became God, other gods became angels. Is that a lecture?
That's a short. That was.
Oh, that's a short.
Very
Okay. Esm G95 says, I wonder why they called him the storm god first, I guess from the great flood. Why did they call Yahweh the storm god first?
Yeah, but it's not. It's not because of the story of the flood. That it's just, you have to remember that we're in this part of the world that where the water, yeah, there's the ocean there, but like the water that you can use for crops is very scarce, and so the rains that happen at the end of the summer is what brings life to these areas. So a storm god is not just like a second class kind of god, but is a very important role, because it basically is the god of life, because it's the god that at the end of the drought of the summer brings the life, that the water, the rains that make possible the growth of vegetation and crops. Now in the library that we got from Ugarit, which is this site, this Canaanite site that was destroyed in 1200 BCE, more or less, that is in the coast of modern day Syria, we get these stories of the Canaanite god Baal, where he is called the rider on the clouds. Baal. It's an epithet,
Right.
which is like a title of a god, because Baal is the god that brings the rains to this whole region of Canaan, from Syria to down to modern day Israel, Palestine. And in a lot of Psalms, Yahweh, the God of Israel, receives the same epithet, the same title. Psalm 68 says, "Sing to God, to Elohim, sing praises to His name, lift up a song to Him who rides upon the clouds." And there are many other psalms where this idea that the God of Israel is a God that rides on the clouds is very present in many psalms. And this is also something that, if you read the flawed version that we get from the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Mesopotamian god Adad or Hadad, also it's in a more graphic description of the god riding on the clouds and bringing the rains that flood the whole earth with some there's additional descriptions, I think, of the chariot and his assistants and things. But this is like a very common motif in the mythologies of the ancient Near East because of how important rains are in this area. So this is why the association is not a mistake, but it is just it's theological. It's cosmological in nature.
Yeah. And so I think, like we are saying here, also, Landra, is that this is one of those, signs or holdovers, an epithet that is actually drawn from this earlier religious era when where Yahweh is emerging out of a pagan, what we might call pagan, a polytheistic pantheon. And as we've talked about it in a bunch of the different lectures, Yahweh, as Yahweh, as they're paring down the pantheon smaller and smaller, and eventually become monolatrists and henotheists and ultimately monotheists, that Yahweh merges with the god El, so that the Yahweh and El become the same. But then, in terms of things like Baal and Hadad and so forth, that Yahweh steals all of their things that they do instead of fully
Yeah,
merging.
I would say an appropriation of the domain of other
Yes.
gods. But again, that's very common. Like
Yeah,
even
of course. Yeah. When that
like
happens, I mean, obviously, like Apollo steals stuff from Helios, right?
right.
As a more popular god eclipses the previous things, it doesn't mean that it doesn't go away. The story is still, and the titles are still liked. They're just applied to the new.
And I guess something that is not obvious in the Bible is that the Bible is not explicit about these things, how Yahweh takes over the powers or the domains of other gods, but there's this constant struggle, especially like when we get to the Deuteronomic history of just making sure that Israelites only worship Yahweh, and in doing so, sometimes you have this kind of wrestling to see, whose God is more powerful to prove that the only God is Yahweh, and um, whereas other mythologies, like Mesopotamian mythology, you have a very explicit case of, like Inanna, for example, going around and claiming, I'm going to claim the sky, I'm going to claim the
Yeah.
underworld. So it's more explicit about that. Whereas in Israel, at least what we have in the Bible, comes from a later period when already Yahweh is established as this the the most important god of the pantheon, or the only god of this monolatrist kind of system. But nevertheless, this echoes of older religions are still there, and that's very clear, especially in the Psalms.
Very good. So another question, Kimmer Zubski asks in the lecture "What Are Angels?" asks, "Is it possible to reconcile Mark 12:25 with Genesis 6:2?" So that part of Mark, it says, when they rise from the dead, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven." Whereas that famous passage in Genesis is, the sons of God saw that the daughters of men are fair, and they took wives for themselves of all they chose. So we have um, the sons of God, which we later understand to be angels, actually taking wives, and yet the angels in Mark are not doing that according to Jesus. How do
Right.
you reconcile that, Leandro?
Yeah, and this is again like the kind of thing that do we have to reconcile. Reconcile is something that, at least in my experience, is something that, like, the more conservative, and or as you say, the more maximalist interpreters or readers of the Bible do, because of this issue that you approach the Bible as the actual inerrant word of God. So everything that the Bible that you read in the Bible has to make sense as a unity, but is, in fact, these are texts that are written by completely different authors and completely different time periods and in different parts. These places were written in different places. These passages, and the authors are talking about something completely different. Like the concern, and here my understanding of what's happening here in Mark is that Mark is talking about how the resurrection of the dead will be. And so humans in this new form of existence will be more like angels. And angels, at least in this understanding, are these beings that are beyond gender. So they don't need to get married and procreate because
Right.
they're beyond that.
They're eternal, and they're like we were talking about with the Gnostics. They are a unity as opposed to divided gender. And
Right.
this is an idea of angel that is much later than anything that existed when the source texts for Genesis are being written here. And this the author here of Genesis is in fact probably echo. This is actually this. They're pulling an echo from when the sons of El, what we later understand to be angels, but the sons of El are actually being demoted from being other gods, and gods with a little g actually do. I mean, as we know from other paganism, they actually do breed, come down to earth and run around and find daughters and rape them and do those kind of things. And so that's certainly not what angels do in the conception of, by the time we get to Christianity and Mark, but it is something that pagan gods do, which is what the echo here is of the much earlier Genesis writer, before we have that later conception of what an angel is.
And that is, now that you mentioned that, that's a really interesting point, because we do have in the book of Deuteronomy the mention of the sons of El as
Yeah.
this council of the supreme God El, and Yahweh is one of these gods who is given Israel as his domain. But then later, like all these other sons of El are demoted, and in the text, then Yahweh is the one that takes precedence. But as you say, the idea of sons of God, sons of El, goes all the
Yes.
way back to Canaanite religion, because the god El had 70 sons, because he was a very very masculine, very powerful god, and so his wife Asherah apparently gave birth to 70 gods. But mostly it doesn't mean that. No, it means that the council of the god El had something like 70 something
Yeah.
gods, and this is what the word originally meant in this religion of Canaan that is being echoed here in this story of Genesis 6, which is it's part of what is called traditionally and the primeval stories, that even the most, I would say, the most conservative readers and the most conservative evangelical theologians understand or will say is not history. That's why there's not a lot of anxiety about reconciling this with later parts of the Bible, because it's understood that everything from creation all the way to Noah is the primeval story, or the Tower of
Antediluvian.
Babel.
Yeah. But
Um,
I think you're giving a lot of benefit of the doubt to the most conservative or whatever. So
Not the most, but the serious, let's say the serious,
all
still
serious, all serious.
academic
Yes,
uh,
all academics.
theologians that will try to make sense still, that with Abraham we can actually find like a core of historicity, which always drives me crazy when we
Yeah.
start seeking for the core of historicity, but they stop at Abraham usually. Yeah, they understand this is mythology.
Yes. Okay. Very good.
Okay, now this is for you, John, because this is
Okay.
about the documentary hypothesis versus the supplementary hypothesis from Yoshi Yahoo. What chapters do you think the second Second John author added in. You, John, put in the, and this is like something that it's referencing one of your slides, but you put it like in pink at the beginning. So do you think that there's this part, the prologue that was written by the redactor? Are you calling the prologue unsophisticated? Um,
So, so even though Leandro, even though this comment was on the lecture about the documentary hypothesis versus the supplementary hypothesis,
yeah.
I probably had this slide as a throwaway slide in that, because I was
Okay.
probably talking about how
So this
we
is
have.
about the Gospel of John.
This is about the Gospel of John. So probably what I was doing is I was showing how we have different ways that a text forms. And so the documentary hypothesis, the supplementary hypothesis are the different ways that scholars have reconstructed how the Torah is formed, the Pentateuch, the 5 books attributed to Moses. And so there's the different charts that might explain where the Yahwist source, the Elohist source, if there is one, the priestly source, and etc. How they came together either through redaction or through by supplement, as one is completely supplements the next, and so forth. So that's what the lecture was about. But I was probably trying to show that, okay, well, we know that there is a supplementing going on in the Gospel of John, because it may well have. We definitely know that there's a final addition that happens where there's a last chapter. So the Gospel ends, and then somebody else has added something to the end. And so I was probably using that as an example, and then I probably put this chart that I had from the Gospel of John lecture that we've done on the signs gospel, that will have shown an early thing of a signs gospel that is then expanded by the first John author, John 1, and then there's a later author, John 2, that is less sophisticated. And so in looking at that chart that I didn't explain it, I would say to Yoshiyahu, go to our whole signs gospel lecture, because and the John gospel lectures, because I'll explain it in bigger details. So you were saying that I'm calling, according to my chart, the prologue of the Gospel of John. This is this incredible story. In the beginning was the Word, the Logos, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. This is very, very sophisticated. You're saying, oh, it's ridiculous if I think the prologue is not sophisticated. No, the prologue is very sophisticated. What I'm saying in the chart is not that the prologue is written by John 2, but rather that the prologue may well, some scholars think, is a freestanding, independent document, like the Book of Generations would be in the Torah, something that the redactor has inserted, or that may have been a pre-existing source, like the Signs Gospel that John 1 is working from. So in other words, there's some kind of, sometimes people think that this hymn of the Logos is its own document, this John 1, this prologue. And that's all that chart was saying. It's not saying that this is the unsophisticated John 2 edits. And so if you're asking what are the examples of the John 2 edits, so I was saying, like in what we now have is John chapter 3, Jesus is talking to Nicodemus, a Jewish elder, and he's talking to him about the need to be born again. And Nicodemus immediately interprets that literally and says, how could you possibly be born again? Can you literally walk up into your mother's womb? And so that's absurd. And so Jesus says in the text that we have it, that no, you have to be born of water and the Spirit. And so a bunch of scholars have said, well, that maybe that of water is actually an insertion, because what Jesus is meaning to say is this is a spiritual thing, but the later writer, John 2, is very aware of a formula, being born again for him is baptism. And so they've added water and the Spirit in order to explain a Christian understanding in their community, but it mars what John 1 is trying to say, that this is an entirely spiritual understanding about being born again, and brings it back into the physical by adding this word water. And so that's what I was saying as an example of like an unsophisticated edit, if that is the case. In other words, if there is a John 1 and a John 2. It's not saying by any means, like your concern Yoshiyahu that I was saying that the prologue is unsophisticated. Absolutely not.
Thank you. And let's jump to a question on, since we're talking about the Gospels and not about the documentary hypothesis. Let's talk about who wrote the Gospels.
Okay.
So the mad professor asks, what I have never understood is how they picked these four Gospels and rejected the others, but never bothered to resolve all the contradictions between and even within the Gospels. So why go halfway and leave all these question marks? So is it they were deliberately trying to offer different versions of these stories?
Yeah, so it is interesting. It's interesting that this happened, Mad Professor. you know, so if the documentary hypothesis for the Torah is correct, in other words, if that is how the Torah is formed, what's happened here is a redactor has taken four different contradictory sources and blended them all together by, in some cases, cutting up a completely one whole creation story, or putting a creation story from the one and put it right next to a second creation story, or taking the Noah story and slicing it up into pieces and using one side by side with the other one. And so one of the questions you may be asking is, okay, well, let's say we had these four gospels that are viewed by early Christians as authoritative. Why didn't some early Christian cut them all up and put them together and make a harmony of the gospel so it's just one book that includes, like all the details from what we now think of as, Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. And so that's certainly something that could have happened, but it didn't. And as you're asking, well, there were all these other gospels that didn't get included. Some of the early ones include the Gospel of Thomas, and apparently also as well. We know that the Ebionites, the Jewish Christians, had their own versions. There's other gospels that we have fragments of that seem very early and yet also distinct that didn't make it in. In terms of how did they pick those four? So the reason why we have all these different gospels is each of the different Christian communities will have had their own gospel that they were using, or that there's the one that they are kind of working from. And so I think in a lot of cases they won't have been using multiple gospels, but different ones are using different ones that they like. And so it's really our friend Irenaeus of Lyon, this really important proto-Orthodox leader, this guy who he's our friend in the sense that we went to Lyon and we found out a lot about him. He is one of the most influential early Christian writers of the 2nd century who is busily deciding what is left in and what it gets in and what is left out. And he's the one that argues, no, we should have 4 gospels and we should have the 4 that we have now have, and we shouldn't have any of the other ones. So he's the one who really convinces everybody. He's able to, I think he's able to make that case by, by saying kind of 4 is kind of a magic number in a way, and also by taking one of the visions from Revelation, and that is what attributes each of the gospels to, the different visionary animals around the throne of God. So the winged lion, the winged bull, or cow, the winged eagle, and the winged guy, and those are the ones that get attached to those ideas. So it's really in Irenaeus that popularized that idea. And by that time, I guess people all had access to them enough that no one had sufficient authority to simply create a harmony of the Gospels and bring it all together into one, although throughout history, Christians have tried to do that.
Thank you. Who knew? Irenaeus.
He did a lot of things, so... I think one of the reasons why he did that is, so he lives in Gaul, right? But he comes from Western Anatolia, what's now Turkey, and he comes from a part of the Christian tradition that includes the Gospel of John. And as we know very well, the Gospel of John is actually very, very different from the other Gospels. And so I think that there were lots of contemporary Christians that might have been very content to just use Matthew and to throw the others away, or in some cases like the Marcionites, and so to just use Luke and throw the other ones away. But I think that because of the community that Irenaeus comes from, he wants to say, no, 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 we have to keep all this John stuff. It's really important. And so he has to make a special intellectual argument to hold on to all of them.
Would that have been because of his fights, arguments against Gnostics and other heretic, or what was becoming heresies?
I think he had to. I think he had to work really hard. I think one of the reasons why he's fighting Gnostics, well, one because there's a bunch of Gnostics in Gaul, and so he's there worrying about it. But I think that one of the reasons why he's fighting it is because the Gospel of John is the most proto-Gnostic of the Gospels that made it in. And so I think that there were a lot of other contemporaries, proto-Orthodox contemporaries of Irenaeus, that are probably saying, all these things that we hear about in John, this could lead us to Docetism. This could lead us to Gnosticism, because again, the Jesus in the Gospel of John is so much has a so much higher Christology, is so much more less human passionate. It is very different from Mark. So.
Right. We have a question that came in the lecture: why Paul's churches won? And I think Deus Volt is a little confused, because apparently in this lecture you said that Paul had a feud with James, but this viewer says that they only had like a brief situation that was reconciled, and that so the
Right.
fact that you're talking about a feud is they don't know where you're getting this information, and I get the sense that they are saying that you're making this is an assumption, an incorrect assumption that you're making here.
Right. And so specifically, he says that the book of Acts talks all about the situation, and it's very minor and easily reconciled.
Mm-hmm.
But again, Deus Vult, the problem here is that you're reading the texts, as a Christian that considers all the texts authoritative, and not as a historian. And so Acts is late, and Acts contradicts Paul. Paul himself is an eyewitness of the fight between him and somebody, including fights that he has directly with Peter and James. And what he has to say, what Paul has to say, contradicts what Acts says. And so, yes, definitely by the time the author of Acts, the author of Luke Acts, is writing, the whole thing is kind of over, and it's that author seems to be wanting to write this to minimize that, and they successfully have convinced you that it was not a big deal, But that doesn't mean that Acts has, Acts has any more historicity than Luke has, and we've already argued, because we already have, we have John and Mark and Matthew in order to test against Luke to see how much, the problems of reading Luke as if though Luke had a lot of historicity. Acts, unfortunately, we don't have more Acts. And so people tend to rely on it a lot, even though, but unfortunately we don't have anything else to read it against. The only thing we have to read it against is the other writings of the New Testament, including especially the writings of Paul. And so as somebody who tries to stay really close to the sources that are really close to the time period, I preference what Paul says, 100 times over anything that exists in Acts. And Paul describes very directly a fight that he has specifically with Peter, and this arguments that he has with James. And he talks even more a lot about other enemies. And in that lecture, I made the case why those other unnamed enemies are in fact actually representatives who have certificates from James's church that are saying that they are real apostles, and then the people in Paul's churches that he's planted himself are saying, you don't have a certificate like this. And so I'm there is some surmise that's happening there. That's the surmise that I'm making, which is that as Paul is talking about other enemies, that those enemies sound a lot like they're coming from the Jamesian church. We can't say that for sure, But we do know that Paul is having a bigger fight with James and Peter than Acts makes it out to be. So Acts can be discounted in that way.
Thank you. And we have two lectures, no, two lectures, two questions on one lecture. How Zoroastrian is Judeo-Christianity. First, big thanks. Ask, why does this lecture, John, start at the Second Temple?
Well, so Zoroastrianism is the world religion that emerged, that emerged out of Persia. So it's a Persian religion, and then as Persia then becomes the first great world empire in the West, um, the Persian emperors, while not imposing their religion on everybody, they nevertheless patronized Zoroastrianism, and so Zoroastrianism has all kinds of influence. So, what is that period? It's the Second Temple period. So, the Second Temple in Judaism is built with the permission of and potentially the command of the Persian emperor. It is built in the Persian Empire. So, Yehud, Judah is at that point a little province within a sub-province within the satrapy of the Persian Empire, and all of the officials like Ezra, the priest, who are and what's his name, Nehemiah. These are official. They're Jewish, but they're Jewish Persian officials. They're officials of the Persian Empire. So I'm starting the lecture with the Second Temple and the Second Temple period because this is a Persian period, and because Zoroastrianism is the Persian religion. That's the important moment of the context, So it would be the same thing when I'm talking about how Greek is Judeo-Christianity. There's Greek influence still already during the Persian period, but it really gets going, obviously, once Alexander conquers the Persian Empire and the whole place becomes Hellenized, right? And so that's why I picked that.
Now, the other question comes from Lee Mackey, 8434. Did Zoroastrian religion come out of Ur at the same time that the Abrahamic religions came out of Ur? And so Abraham went west, but then whoever was the patriarch of Zoroastrianism went
Zoroaster, Zarathustra.
yeah. Is that the idea? Or another question is, so did the religion of Akhenaten, can we, so I guess there's two questions here. That's one question. Then the next question is like the religion of Akhenaten, the pharaoh Akhenaten, is it something that we can link to the Abrahamic religions?
Yeah, so Lee Mackey, you got it backwards because you're reading the Bible as history. So the Bible, Genesis, says that Abraham came out of Ur of the Chaldees, but Abraham is not a historical figure. Abraham is a legendary mythic figure. The Abrahamic religions are emerging later, as opposed to the Zoroastrianism and the Akhenaten religion, which are going to be the earlier ones. Zoroaster does not come from Ur. What's happening in Ur is what would have been just, regular Mesopotamian paganism. It certainly has a relationship to Canaanite paganism, which is what Israelite religion, which is initially pagan, comes out of. But it's not because of any transmission of a character Abraham. What's happening is after you already have an Israelite religion that has legendary figures like Abraham, a myth of Abraham coming from the East is created because the people in Lesser Syria, Palestine, Judea, Israel, that area, are aware that there are two great centers of thought around them. There's Mesopotamia and there's Egypt, and so they create essentially legendary stories about how ideas and people came from those two places. So you have the Exodus myth and you have the Abraham myth, but theirs are not. Anyway, it's not. Those are myths to explain their religion later, as opposed to a historical, how it's happening as a historical spread. And certainly, Zoroaster is also not coming from Ur. He's a Persian figure, and he emerges from Persia. in terms of Akhenaten as well. So he's an Egyptian, and he's getting his ideas natively in Egypt.
And you can see here the problem when we start trying to arrive at these comparisons between different religions when we take the text of one of them as history, and then we start just going backwards.
Yeah. Yep.
We have a question that came on Facebook from Alan Young, who asks, where does the tradition of the Holy Ghost, the Holy Spirit, come from? Is there a Greek or a Canaanite tradition of the triad gods? I mean, I guess, again, we have two questions here. One, where does the tradition of the Holy Spirit come from? And then now, when we think about the Holy Spirit as part of the Christian Trinity, is there any parallels that we can see in the Canaanite or in the Greek traditions?
So there are biblical references to the Spirit of God in the Hebrew Bible, and so one of the places where that exists is in the creation story from the priestly source in Genesis. And so as God is in creation saying, "Let there be light," we see that the Spirit of God hovers over the waters of chaos, right? And so there are references to this. And so later on, as people are attempting to understand God, the Hebrew Bible is already authoritative for them. And so it's coming. I think it's coming from there, as opposed to. I don't know that it's. I don't think that it's coming from a tradition of triad gods. I think that. By the time the Trinity is being formed, there is already enough references to both the Father, to Christ, and then there's also to the references to the Spirit in texts that are being viewed as authoritative by Christians, that this has to be reconciled, as opposed to wanting to get to the number three. I don't know if you have any other thoughts about where those come from, Leandro, at the beginning.
Yeah, so definitely as you say, in the story of creation, we get the Ruach Elohim, that is the spirit or the breath of God, that is at the beginning in this role of helping creation happen, helping creation come out of the void, the chaos. In Canaanite tradition, you have once again talking about these epithets. One of the epithets of the goddess Asherah, who is the consort of El, is something like she who hovers over the surface of the sea.
Yeah.
And this image of the spirit that is like breath or like a wind that is hovering over the surface of chaos suggests it's very suggestive, the connection between that and this idea of Asherah as this same kind of cosmological role, because the sea is seen in Canaanite tradition as a primeval force, as chaos. One of the two. The other one is death. So remember, it's like on one side you have the sea, and on the other side you have the desert. Those are two primeval forces that you have to wrestle with. And Asherah is the one that helps El conquer these, not conquer, but bring order out of the chaos. But then in terms of the triads, it's not. I think it's a different kind of concept. Like, because you do have like these. There's El, Baal, Anat, or sometimes El, Asherah, Athirat, who are like this triads of the in this Canaanite religion, depending on what city you go to. And the same thing is true in the Greek world. There might be three gods like Zeus, Athena, Apollo, who are the main gods of your city, but it doesn't mean that there's some kind of a trinity in the Christian sense. These are distinct gods.
Right.
Um,
Should we turn to live chat
I think
questions?
we have to. Oh my God, it's 9 p.m. So let's first of all say thank you to those of you who have uh, helped the channel with your super chats tonight. We JM, Phil, Fire Ever Living, Don Millard, Daniel, Seda, and also I think it was we had Zorak. So thank you very much for supporting the channel. And remember, you can also do that on our website, centerplace.ca. Okay, let's go to the live questions because otherwise we're never going to get out of here.
Okay.
Is it? Yeah, it's 9 already here for some of us.
Wow.
Videos for Stuff says, if you had a device that allowed you to view the objective truth of one historical event, which event would you pick? Historian.
Yeah. This is like, for me, this is like the, like the question, like if you could go to visit a historical figure, who would you go have lunch with or something like that?
Yes.
And, and I always pass on these because I feel like I don't need to go talk to have lunch with anybody. And I also don't know. I feel like, it's like it's like a burning question that you just have to know how it went. And for me, I feel like his historical methodology gets us to what we can know or not know, and as close as we get is that's what we can know, and that's great. And if we can say it more definitively, that's fine. I'm not saying that I'm not sure that I have something that's a mystery that just lingers over me and I just can't take it, that we don't have it. Do you have an idea?
But I think it would be difficult to, if I had some device like that, like a time machine of knowledge, it
Hmm.
would be difficult to just pick one event out of
Yeah.
so many things, so many possible things that are open questions because we don't have uh, enough data. Like
I
there's
mean, I
this
guess
almost like a
you would go and find out the actual. I mean, it's like this thing, like you go and find out the actual Aramaic sayings of Jesus, and that way that would allow you to objectively know kind of what happened in terms of Q and the other sources, the Markan source, the Matthean source, the Lucan source. That would help us to know those things. Same thing, you could go back and hear absolutely everything that Socrates ever said, and that way you would know what's the Platonic Socrates, what is it? I mean, at the end of that Platonic question about how much of Plato's Socrates is Plato, and so forth. I mean, I'd be interested in those things. Maybe that I would do. I mean, or
I
one of
heard
those.
I remember a science fiction book where they had to decide something like that. They had constructed this time machine, and one of the I don't remember where all the options were. One of the options was something about the American Revolution that was at the time I had no idea about American history, so that I
Who
totally
shot
don't know
first?
why that would have been of interest to anyone. But but the other one, so the one that won was like the last days of Jesus. So they actually decided to go to Jerusalem for the time of the Passion to see if it really happened, and
Okay.
it did happen.
Okay. All right. I guess for me, I would rather know the teachings firsthand so that we could know that than just so we would have it. It wouldn't necessarily change anything other than just would know what the historical Jesus's actual teachings were, or same thing Socrates, somebody like that, as opposed to the event. But I guess the question was about an event, I guess. So.
There's a question from Deborah Dartharama. Ayana Hirshi Ali was raised in Muslim Brotherhood, escaped, and was an atheist for many years, and now she's a fledgling Christian. Can you discuss the new movement of Christianity as a social response to save Western civilization? There are many people seeking community, but who call themselves Christian atheists.
Well, um, I think that there's a bunch of Christian atheists, and so there was a big controversy a couple of years ago in the United Church of Canada, which is the big Protestant church, which is also very liberal, where one of the pastors in the Greater Toronto area kind of came out as an atheist, and the church wasn't sure what to do about that. I feel like my feeling on this is that there is for kind of Christian atheists, there is this idea of God that is very literalistic and fleshy and all of these kind of things that people are so fixated on that they need to reject that idea, and that makes them then atheist, as opposed to what I would call like undefining God, which is to say where we don't where we can reject that fleshy literalistic conception and instead go back to some of these more abstract philosophical ideas that are embedded in the tradition very strongly. That therefore we don't necessarily have to, you don't necessarily have to say, well, that's atheism. You could say this is a very esoteric and philosophical way of looking at God, a very non-literal way of looking at God. That said, that's fine. We have this understanding that people are pretty fixated on, and so there are Christian atheists, and I think that there is value to that because Western civilization, as we now call it, the word Western civilization is a word that we made up in order to secularize Christendom, and much of Western civilization is so thoroughly rooted in our whole tradition, which is not fully secular, but rather has all of these things, both culture, music, all the buildings, architecture, everything. I think that the wholesale rejection of Christianity that happened was a wrong turn, and it was done because of anti-clericalism. So clerics, church leaders, were rotten. They were insisting on, literalism, all kinds of other problems. They wouldn't allow for us to undefine God and to have new, looser ways of doing it. And so the big thinkers decided, okay, well then we'll reject all of you and your whole stupid institution. And I think that that has been a problem. So I do think that there's an advantage to going back and saying, okay, those clerics were wrong, but that doesn't mean we have to reject all of our inheritance.
But I also see it as what Western people do with Eastern religions, or
Yeah,
what we have been doing since the 60s, where we try to distill everything that is quote unquote religious or
right.
ritualistic, from Buddhism, from Taoism, and what we focus on is the ethical teachings and maybe some meditative practices and things like that. And I think there's the same intention behind these people that we sometimes identify as these atheist Christians, is to value that there's something in the tradition, but putting aside certain
The
things,
part,
in a way cherry picking what do you like about the religion and coming up with something new. But ultimately, you're going to have your own practices and your own sets of values, because as you select what do you work with, you're doing your own religion or set of values a la carte.
yeah. And so now I think that there's a value in doing it that way. I think, like you said, as of the '60s, again, as kind of the tail end of this anti-clerical, the not liking, some of the ways that churches had positions that they'd staked out, independent-minded people, like the Beatles going off to some ashram or something like that. There, people decided to, Westerners decided to go and take the parts of Eastern traditions that they liked and make a very new thing that purged of a bunch of stuff. And now I think in the 21st century, we're maybe kind of looking at that and saying, well, we also have to be aware of like appropriation, and that kind of a thing, where we're taking other people's stuff. Whereas you could do that within your own tradition, because the kind of Western Taoism or Western Buddhism is very, very different from the actual lived religious experience that you would get like in a in a village in an actual Buddhist country like Sri Lanka or something like that.
Yeah.
And and that's there's some value in trying to do that sort of program, but within your own tradition, in which in the Western civilization is Judeo-Christianity.
Ricky Palacios has okay, we have to make sure that we summarize this question.
Okay.
Can you explain the concept of Christology? And I would say, and then John add any other notes, but this is one of the sub branches or like sub studies within theology. Theology, as Saint Anselm said, famously said, is the our faith seeking understanding. And
Right.
now within theology, when you focus on Christ, so is Christ and are the Father and the Son the same substance or different substance? Is Christ fully divine and fully human? How many natures does Christ have? All these questions concern Christology. Christology is also very intimately related to another part of the theology, the study of theology with this, which is soteriology, soter, which is to save, so the salvation part of theology. So Christology also often includes not only these complicated questions about the substance and nature of Christ as it relates to the Father, but also how Christ saves, which is soteriology, but sometimes as part of Christology. And there's other sub-studies within theology, like ecclesiology. That's another one of these approaches of theology that specifically focus, in this case, ecclesiology, on ecclesia, which is the body of Christ, the church. I don't know, John, if there's anything else to add.
Yeah. I want to say just the reason you summarize it great. I would just say the reason why we have to have a whole complicated Christology is Christians are absolutely monotheists, and yet how do we explain who Jesus is then? What is Christ? So it becomes a big complicated thing, and different Christians have had wildly different answers to that, and so that's why we have to have a Christology.
Fire Ever Living says, do you have any thoughts on concordant believers? They try to interpret the Bible in a way that's rigorously internally consistent, which ends up with weird and interesting results.
I mean, I haven't heard of this movement. I guess. Have you heard of this, Landon?
I don't know, but it makes me think of concordance, but that's
Yeah.
probably something
But I
really
mean,
different.
just from the context that Fire Ever Living has given us, I would say that that's what lots of Christians have always tried to do, although they haven't done it consistently and rigorously, like you're talking about. And I agree that if you were to try to, if you like we had said before, I think earlier today, if you imagine that all of the different books in the Bible, which are written with very different voices, perspectives, competing voices that don't agree with each other, and you instead believe that they actually are rigorously internally consistent and then try to draw conclusions about it, I would believe you, Fire Ever Living, that you would get very weird results. I mean, it'd be interesting to see what those results are. I think that instead a lot of Christians view the Bible that way, but don't get the weird of results because they don't approach it in a way that's rigorously internally consistent, and instead just pick the parts that they want to emphasize.
We have Julie Bizevsky asking, do you think there is any connection between the Essene community and later ideas of desert monks and monastics? Or is Greek philosophical denigration of the physic, the catalyst?
It's a great question, Julie. I think it could be a little both, right? So I think that is, we're, by the time we have the desert fathers, or these early Christians who go off and are denigrating the physical and are therefore being imbued with, as far as their contemporaries are concerned, all kinds of really spiritual power and spiritual energy because they're showing how little food they need or how little other comfort they need, and that is definitely pulling out of lots of pre-existing Greek philosophical traditions since. Everybody from the Cynics and so on have already been sort of doing that kind of thing. Nevertheless, we also have this Essene community that is doing that same thing, and it does seem that the people have asserted potential connections between the Essenes and John the Baptist, and therefore some kind of connections there that may be relatively direct. So in that sense, there is a potential model there, but I do think that the Greek aspect is going to inform a lot of what they're doing.
We have another question from Anthony Sprague, who also just supported our channel with a super chat. Thank you so much. And asks, how likely is it that the canonical gospels each had multiple authors and that the texts evolved over time with their own specific religious communities?
So each one of these has a different answer, presumed potentially, Anthony, because each one is coming out of its own specific community, as you're saying, and so we talked earlier in this about the Gospel of John and how many literary critics have gone through and identified texts that are evolving over time within what we now call the Johannine community. And so that does seem that may well be the case, that there are additional authors. It's most likely the case within that gospel that is emerging within that. Most scholars agree that the Lucan and Matthean communities have at least each have themselves 3 different sources. So there's Matthean material, there's access to the Gospel of Mark, there's access to the Lost Sayings Gospel Q, and likewise the same thing in Luke, only with Lucan material. And then with Mark, there's a bunch of questions. Mark is the earliest of the Gospels that have come down to us, but it's also the earliest that has a narrative gospel. And so the question is are there sources that underlie Mark? And some scholars see that, and so they think that maybe Mark is, for example, reliant on a passion source. But other scholars think that the passion narrative within Mark, has a lot of the same thematic things of the whole rest of Mark. And so it's not clear if there's a whole emerging thing with Mark. There's some edits to Mark over time potentially, but maybe not. It may be more coherent as a whole, but it's not certain.
And I think the question also is specifically like we know that, for example, there's multiple authors with the Gospel of John,
right?
But I wouldn't say there are multiple authors writing the other Gospels. There might be minor edits, but especially Mark. But for the most part, both Matthew and Luke are the work of one author.
Yeah, I'm sorry. They're working with multiple sources, and then they're
sources, but there's one author.
Yeah, and specific, especially, yeah. So for sure, and Luke, for example, we can say for sure is one author because Luke is a great author who has made the seams very hard to detect, and so
also wrote Acts.
Yeah.
So we have a question. Okay, this question is a little weird. Richard Martin, my family says at church they talked about the war in Israel and the Middle East countries, and that if you read from the Bible using the current names, then the Bible is talking about current events, which I think, I guess what that means is if you change the names of particular stories of the Bible and would just scratch, Philistia, and you write Palestine, then you might think that the conflict is, the Bible is talking about the war. I mean, the occupation of Gaza right now,
Yeah.
which of course that's I would I would say that's misusing the Bible. I'm not sure what other conclusions you might get when you do that kind of exercise, but that is not a, how the that I wouldn't consider that responsible use of the Bible.
Yeah, so that kind of interpretation goes back at least to the Middle Ages, where people have had, what I call that is, what was it? I say like, I can't remember the word I was using for it. It's essentially your, like, I don't know, like a temporal egomania, where you think that a 2000, in some cases, part 2000, some cases 2500 or so year old book, that it's referring specifically to the time you happen to be living in right now. And ever since Joachim of Fiora did that as a medieval monk in the 12th century, that has been an incredibly popular idea. And so every few years, someone will update that and with that same perspective, and think that the Bible's not talking about Joachim of Fiora's day. It's not talking about the Millerites' day in the 1840s. It's not talking about any other day where anybody's been thinking it's about them. They think it's talking about us right now, but it's not. so in fact, actually, all of the authors are talking about their own day, not and it's the day that when they're writing, not even the day when their story is set. So it is not talking about today for sure.
A question from David Latorre, or David or David, I don't know. What date would we feel confident in applying when it could be said that Judaism became a genuine monotheistic religion? And I would say,
You were to say what, Leonard?
I wouldn't say like it's like, yeah, I wouldn't say a date. I wouldn't say like, like June 20th, 584 BCE, that day. No, but I tend to be on. I tend to side, or what makes most sense to me, and to answer this question is the most minimalist scholarship, which will say that it happens starts to happen in the exilic period with like some second Isaiah, and then it's something that fully develops post exilic during the Persian period.
Yeah. So that's what I would say too. In the Second Temple period, because even if some of the early thinkers are coming up with those ideas in the exilic period, it takes a while to get the ideas into everybody's head. So.
And that also like, I guess the question is, well, depending what you mean by Judaism,
Oh yeah.
because where was Israel, like 100% of all the people of Israel were all monotheists, and the answer to that would be no. That like older practices that you might not that might not fit within what we consider monotheism continued,
Right. And so, for
even
example,
even into like the Jesus's times.
and we have in the Second Temple period, we have the example of the Elephantine Jews in the exilic in diaspora Egypt, where the temple there has multiple deities, right? And so it's a work in progress during the Second Temple period.
But even John, when you consider like now in this period, the Persian period, the Hellenistic period, Hasmonean period, we have the development of all this angelology,
Yeah.
and we have to consider, well, but what do we mean by monotheism if there's like these other divine beings that are lesser than God but are not human? So there's so I guess the question that I'm trying to say is also depending on what you mean by strict monotheism. If you consider that Satan, that angels are their own entities, divine entities, separate from God, then that still qualifies as some form of polytheism, and that definitely was happening in this period.
But nobody ever gets to a thing that's free of divine beings. In other words, those are subordinate divine beings are still, allowed within monotheistic religions, and that's why I've said, by some definitions, and certainly I've gone to Hindu temples where the leader of the temple has said, "Well, we're monotheists, even though we have 4 million gods, because we, or 40 million or 30 million, however many, because we recognize there's one divine source." And so I would agree that counts as monotheism, in the same way that that the Gnostics, if there's like ultimately one true God or something like that, is a monotheism,
Right.
even if there's other emanations.
We have kinetic. How many more questions do we have? Oh, we're almost done. Since the
Okay.
Septuagint renders the Tetragrammaton as Kyrios, the Greek word for Lord, does that mean that the authors of the synoptic gospels are calling the name of Yahweh when they quote Isaiah 40 verse 3 before the baptism?
I have to look up. Oh yeah, the Isaiah 43 is a voice of one calling in the wilderness, "Prepare the way of the Lord, make straight a desert in the desert a highway for our God." So in other words, the quotation that is that Christians apply to John the Baptist. So the Lord there, make way prepare the way for the Lord. That is that would be the Tetragrammaton in Isaiah. So yes.
Mason Phillips asks, were there attempts by the Romans in Judea to syncretize the Jewish faith at the time? I know Zoroastrianism was around, but I'm curious how the Romans dealt with monotheism so close to their provinces, or more, or rather in one of their provinces.
So, so I guess kind of famously, Caligula was about to put his statue up in the Jewish temple right before he died, right? Or it's Caligula, right? Who was going to do that? So, I mean, I think that there were some times. It certainly had happened in the Hellenistic period where the Seleucid kings, Antiochus IV, was attempting to kind of impose a syncretism, to say, to put a statue of Zeus there and say that Yahweh, the God of Israel, is Zeus, for syncretism. And I think that the Romans occasionally were trying to do the same thing. Maybe Caligula was trying to do that, and same thing whenever the presence of Roman eagles in there. But I think that at a certain point, I mean, the Romans ended up fighting 3 Roman Jewish wars, right? So there's, they weren't going to accomplish that because there was just too much pushback.
Apparently, Mike tells us there was a discussion in the chat about the distinction between Lucifer and Satan, and Dartharama asks, Dartharama says rather, I've never really understood how morning stars refers both to Lucifer and Jesus.
So yeah, I guess in Christian theology, there's sometimes Jesus is referred to as the bright morning star, and that means that he's like a bringer of hope and new beginnings. But then we also have the idea that Lucifer is the morning star because of a reference to the morning star in Isaiah. So the morning star is Venus, and so Venus is a god in paganism. The reference in Isaiah is to a king of Babylon who was equating himself with a Babylonian god that represents Venus. And then later, because all of the references to things like Lucifer or the devil and even the serpent in the Old Testament are all brought together to mean the devil. That's why we think of the devil as being Lucifer, the morning star. Lightbringer is a lightbringer. Lucifer is the Latin for the morning star. But nevertheless, the morning star has multiple different meanings. And so when Jesus is the morning star, that's because the morning star represents new beginnings. And so we're having, everybody there's like a symbol can be used to mean more than one thing, I guess is what we'd say. I mean, the
Sorry.
devil isn't actually the planet Venus, nor is Jesus the planet Venus. Planet Venus is a symbol, and and as but by the way, Venus is also the evening star, and so because of because we also realize now that how the heliocentric solar system works as opposed to a geocentric solar system, and so now we realize, oh, that's actually the same planet. And so the symbol of appearing before the dawn, that means it's the light bringer and so forth. And so that is in a time period when people looked at the sky a lot more than we do now, it was an important symbol, and so the symbol can be applied to more than one thing.
Well, I can't see any stars, so I would look at the sky more if I could. But yeah, and it is. And I guess if you think of all the way back to Sumer, Ishtar was also associated with the planet Venus, which is
Well, and let's say I would also suggest perhaps the goddess Venus is associated with the planet Venus.
there might be an association there. Okay, so we have a few questions left in the queue. Let's see if we can get through it. I guess John Tracy Poster said, was Jesus rescued from the cross and not resurrected? That's why people saw him afterwards. I would guess no, but what do you think?
So again, this is a kind of a thing that people would like to do as if the Gospels were eyewitness accounts and they're trying to explain it, right? And so an idea is that people have is that they will look at the Gospel accounts and say, well, I don't believe that people can actually walk on water, and so therefore maybe Jesus was walking in a shallow part of the Sea of Galilee or something like that, and it only seemed to be walking on water or something like that. And they do the same thing with like the parting of the Red Sea. Maybe the wind was blowing in the kind of way like this or something. So these are not eyewitness accounts. These are literary things that happen later. The Gospels are kind of clear, actually, that the disciples are all scattered. And so what a lot of historians of the historical Jesus, like, for example, John Dominic Crossan, will say is that the most likely scenario is that Jesus was just body was just thrown in a mass grave, and he didn't have there was no tomb or any of these things, and that these ideas of people seeing the wounds later are simply visionary experiences that decades later are written down as if they were literal physical experiences. But you don't have to explain it away if you don't believe in physical resurrection. You can simply say these are written later.
So in other words, you're saying that this kind of interpretation is part of this attempt to rationalize the Bible so that the miracles and the supernatural all of a sudden make sense in our modern minds. Like, for example, the parting of the waters in Exodus was actually a tsunami or something like that.
That's right. Yeah, all we can do, instead of worrying about having to explain things like that, we can simply say Exodus is a myth. The waters didn't do that. So I appreciate that people want to take. We can do the same thing with Greek mythology. People want to take supernatural things that we don't believe happen anymore, and then try to have a kind of a physical explanation for them. It's simply not necessary. That's taking it the wrong direction.
John Daniel Seda and Lorenzo Schliestack ask about the Gospel of Tatian the Assyrian. Are you familiar with that?
The Gospel of Tatian the Assyrian.
It was popular in Assyrian churches, but eventually replaced. So I'm not familiar. So we might have to look it up.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Daniel and Lorenzo. We'll have to get back to you on it. It sounds very interesting. I know that it's replaced by I've heard of the Peshitta and things like that. So I just want to, I say it's called the Diatessaurian Harmony. So, which was an attempt to harmonize the Gospels. We're asking. We'll look it up and we'll talk to you next time.
Valda asks, who wrote the book of Deuteronomy? And she adds, or they add, Moses was a man not of words at the burning bush, but then he's able to compose the book of Deuteronomy. I wonder if the Assyrians wrote the book of Deuteronomy.
So I think traditionally most scholars have understood the book of Deuteronomy to be, or at least the core components of the book of Deuteronomy, to be this book that is found by Hilkiah, the scribe in the court of Josiah. That's where most, a lot of scholars now think that it's even later than that. But the book, the Deuteronomic histories the books of Kings describe this event where, Wada, this book that they'd never seen before has been found. And when they read it, all of these rules and everything like that they have never heard of before, they realize haven't been being fulfilled. And so the king rends his garments. He can't believe about it. And this is the impetus for a reform. So people who write it in that scenario will have been priests at the time of the very end of the First Temple period. And that might just represent the core of Deuteronomy, which was then expanded, maybe in the exilic and the immediate post-exilic period. But it would have been it's Judean priests who wrote it, not Assyrians.
There's another question about the historicity of the apostles. And John, you gave a lecture on who were the apostles. Yeah. Now,
right.
Which ones were historical?
So we don't. So one of the things that we have about the apostles, one, we should remember that the 12 and the larger group of Christian apostles is two different things. So early Christianity is founded by groups of mendicants, men and women, who are going around and spreading the good news by mendicant, that is begging. They're not taking purse or scrip. They are speaking from the Spirit, and they are planting Christian communities as they go around. And so there is not just 12 of those people. One of the examples of an apostle we have that is not one of the 12 is Paul, who is obviously a very famous one. As we call him the Apostle Paul, he definitely calls himself an apostle. He is not one of the 12. So there's a bunch of apostles. I presume you're, though, asking Owen about the 12 apostles. And all of the lists that we have of the 12 are late. They're coming out of the Gospels, and they contradict each other. And so of these, how do we know which ones are historic? So the Apostle Paul, who is our earliest Christian, who contemporaneously knows some of these folks, he himself talks about having known and met Peter and John. And he also says he met the Apostle James, but James is James, the brother of Jesus, so he is not one of the 12. So in other words, we know there are historical apostles, Peter, James, and John, but that James is not one of the two apostles named James on our list of the 12. Owen also asks, did Peter actually exist and die in Rome? We don't have any direct, firsthand early information for that. That's a much later tradition. So the Apostle Paul is a real apostle, but and we know he got as far as Antioch. We don't know if he ever went to Rome, although tradition says he does. And so how many apostles are real? There were hundreds of real apostles, thousands probably. But in terms of the ones of the 12, minimally we can't say. I don't think that we can say more than the 3. And actually, one of those is not one of the 12, so 2. So 2, or I guess in terms of the list of 12. But that doesn't mean that there wasn't important early leader named Thomas or an important early leader, named Philip or all of these other names. There were certainly, and so but they wouldn't necessarily have been as described in the Gospels, which are late.
Okay, last question. Richard Martin, writing a scripture seems like an insurmountable task. Can you comment on what type of person would be capable of writing a scripture and what it would take to write a scripture that gets adopted? And this, for some reason, makes me think of Joseph Smith, the Book of Mormon, and the apologetics about that some Mormons will offer to say, well, clearly this is not the work of a human being because of this and this and this, and or trying to say that Joseph Smith would not have been capable, that he was illiterate or hardly literate, to somehow elevate the value of scripture.
Right. So, yeah, it's not. I know that writing a book seems like it's a big deal, but actually there are millions and millions of books, and people write books, and so that it's not insurmountable, in even in antiquity. Uh, so, what kind of persons would it take? Each one of these different kinds of people, including even just in the New Testament. So they have a wide variety of skill level with the language that they're composing in. In the New Testament, it's Greek, and so we get to some of the writers like the author of Luke Acts, which is a very educated Greek writer, the kind of writer of Greek, maybe Greek is their native language, and they one of the things that they have in their background is they are intensely familiar with the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, the Septuagint, and so that is informing who they are. So all of the writers have a lot of familiarity with the Greek version of the Hebrew Bible, and so that is a big thing to happen. Joseph Smith actually he's spent his whole life growing up in Christian churches, listening to preachers preach, and so he also has a lot of familiarity with the King James version of the Bible, and that definitely informed his composition of the Book of Mormon. And so all of these different writers are informed by that kind of reading.
And even I guess I'm thinking of books that are not necessarily considered scripture, but that have special value within Christianity. I'm thinking of the writings of the women mystics in the Middle Ages, like Julian of Norwich, like Hildegard, like Methhild, who reported having visions and wrote really, really extensively. Now, it's not scripture, but or like Teresa of Avila, John of the Cross, that wrote this spiritual text that is like highly revered by many Christians today, and it's long and complicated and beautiful, and yet we know that who the author is.
Right, that's right. Yeah.
And I have a question, John, about your work with the Canadian Council of Churches, and if you're ever are going to tell us a little bit about that. Not tonight, but if you're yeah, not tonight.
Sure. Yeah. So the Canadian Council of Churches is an ecumenical body that is really an interesting one, because the Canadian version of that, so in the US, there's the National Council of Churches, both of which are part of the World Council of Churches. So ecumenical bodies are different Christian groups trying to get together and work together on causes that they can all agree are important. And the Canadian Council of Churches is special because it's a little more inclusive than all the rest, because we have full participation of the Catholic Church, for example, and also all of the Canadian versions of all the smaller Orthodox churches and so on. It represents maybe 85% of Canadian Christians. So the main people that are outside of it are groups like Pentecostals, evangelicals, and Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses and so forth. Yeah, I'm very happy to. I'm observer delegate for Community of Christ, and they have annual meetings semi-annually. So the next meeting will be in November, and I can report on it after we do that.
All right. Thank you. And finally, I found many comments in that you left in our videos asking about those charts and timelines that John uses, that John creates for our lectures. And so the good news is that we are starting our newsletter, so you can subscribe to our newsletter. And I promise we're not going to spam you with irrelevant content, but one of the things that is going to go in those newsletters is those charts that you see in the Tuesday lectures, and in additional content like summaries of the lectures and other things that John says in this channel.
Yeah,
I'll,
yeah. So, wanted to have a way of sharing. We love a timeline. We love like org charts and even some of the maps that I've created originally. Anyway, when I make an original map or other diagrams. So we will start to include those in our new newsletter that we're going to do. And so you can sign up for that at our website, centerplace, spelled the Canadian way, .ca/sign up. So centerplace.ca/sign up. So like Leandro says, we're not going to spam you. We'll do a newsletter, and it'll include.
we spam you, you unsubscribe. That's easy.
Yeah, you can always unsubscribe. But yeah, so we'll just, it'll include recaps from some of the questions like we're doing here, some of those graphics, other kinds of insights like that. What are upcoming lectures, or if we have to cancel, that kind of a thing. So you get those notices.
Next week.
We're going to start it next week.
No, what's next week?
Oh, okay. Next week we're going to have the Stoic Jesus. The Stoic Jesus. So please join us for that. This has been a lot of fun.
Yeah, it's going to be a fun one. And thanks everyone for the chat and for the questions tonight. Oh my God, it's almost 10 here. But don't forget to click like and share and to subscribe to our channel if you haven't yet. And of course, if you're able to support the work that we do here with a donation to help us continue to produce this content. Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye, everybody. Thank you again.